Welcome to my American History Notes, where I discuss the conclusions I've drawn from studying American history. Conclusions you might not agree with, which is fine, but you should at least know about the people, the places, the events, the dates, the concepts I talk about, and much more, much deeper to be conversant in American history. And many of you already know about certain events and people very much more even than I do. So it's not a hard thing to ask you to study American history. So I'm going to read um, from my notes and think about what I'm saying. So if you'll bear with me just a moment. Excuse me. Okay, James Buchanan of Pennsylvania was the last of the weak compromising presidents elected before the Civil War, according to most historians. But he did try to follow the strictures the Constitution placed on him. So give him the benefit of the doubt. Although Frederick Douglass, who believed the Constitution did not support slavery, would probably argue with me on that. He was, like Buchanan was, like Pierce, a Northern Democrat, more supportive of Southern slave owners than of Northern abolitionists. He was also the only president who never married, devoting his life to public service as a congressman, senator, diplomat, minister to Russia and England, and Secretary of State before becoming president. He might have also been gay. I don't know. There's all kinds of rumors about that, and but we won't get into that. Doesn't matter. It would be a scandal at that time. Um, Failing to win the Democratic nomination for president in 1848, he retired to his estate called Wheatland near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In 1852, he was given the job of minister to Great Britain. He was made famous by uniting with the ministers to France and Spain, who were militant pro-slavery advocates, to write the Ostend Manifesto, which advocated the purchase of Cuba from Spain and simply taking it if they refused to sell. Although cheered by the South, it was wildly denounced by Northerners. At the Democratic National Convention in Cincinnati in June 1856, the Ostend Manifesto and Buchanan's time in England put him in good stead, and his two chief rivals, President Pierce and Senator Stephen A. Douglas, were tainted by the pro-slavery cause in Kansas, where a bitter civil war had broken out, a real civil war, neighbor against neighbor, not connected with what was called Bleeding Kansas. Buchanan won. Two new parties, fragments of the now defunct Whigs, opposed him in the general election. The anti-slavery Republican Party nominated John C. Fremont, the soldier adventurer who had his hand in the seizing of California under Polk, and the conservative Whigs, calling themselves the Know Nothings, picked former President Millard Fillmore. Buchanan won the presidency easily. Buchanan announced in his inauguration that he would be this would be his one and only term, no matter what, which threw the leadership of his party to Stephen A. Douglas. He insisted that the Kansas dispute be settled by the Supreme Court. Chief Justice Roger Taney had already informed him he was about to pass down a pro-slavery decision in the infamous Dred Scott case, holding that Congress did not have the power to prohibit slavery in the territories, thereby nullifying the Missouri Compromise of 1820. He also announces that really got President or future President Abraham Lincoln to think, he said publicly, well, this means that they could force us to accept slavery throughout the country. So, he was kind of getting worried about that. He also announced his intention to buy Cuba from Spain and Alaska from Russia, but negotiations toward these ends did not succeed. Finally, he bragged about the large federal surplus America had and how well off we were. Then the panic of 1857 and the depression which followed it drove many businessmen into bankruptcy, threw thousands out of work, and converted the surplus into a deficit of $27 million, which is a lot of money back then. And a trial run to the federal government exerting its force in the Civil War, Buchanan seized the governorship of Utah from a rebellious Brigham Young. And in the Utah War, Mormons burned two federal forts and suffered under a military occupation and a presidential appointed governor. Buchanan sought to admit Kansas as a slave state, but when he submitted the Lecompton Constitution for Kansas to Congress, Northern Democrats revolted, joining Republicans to defeat the bill. Buchanan forces revived the bill with an added bribe of several million acres to finance the new state government, but Kansas voted it down anyway. During this time, Stephen A. Douglas, who had been against the Lecompton Constitution, but pro-slavery defeated Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, and kept his Senate seat. Famous debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates helped solidify the North against President Buchanan. During the last 2 years in office, Buchanan was more of a figurehead. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in an attempt to stir up a slave insurrection convinced many Southerners that secession from the Union or withdrawing from it was their only hope of saving slavery from the Northern abolitionists. Southern states began openly discussing secession, and in South Carolina and Mississippi, military defense budgets were passed. Buchanan did nothing to interfere with these actions, believing that while secession was unconstitutional, so would be federal government exertions of force used to stop it, in spite of what he had done in Utah. Southern legislatures passed measures that if a, quote, black Republican were elected, they would secede from the Union. The fatal split in the Democratic Party ensured the election of the, quote, black Republican, Abraham Lincoln, in 1860, although peace Democrats, called Copperheads by the Republican opponents for the copper pennies that they wore as identifying badges, would oppose him throughout the war to come. South Carolina immediately prepared to secede and did so on December 20th. Buchanan warned of an impending, quote, open war by the North to abolish slavery in the South, but he managed to avoid it during his administration, so it could be blamed on the Republicans. Mississippi seceded on January 9th, 1861, Florida on January 10th, Alabama on January 11th, Georgia on January 19th, Louisiana on January 26th, and Texas on February 23rd. Now, General John Logan, writing after the Civil War, wrote the book, The Great Conspiracy, Its Origin and History, a history of the Civil War in the United States of America. Logan helped start Memorial Day as a national holiday and would be a very interesting subject of independent study. He asserts in his book that the slave states were never fully committed to the United States of America as they were to the institution of slavery, and that after many false starts, their withdrawal from the Union was predictable. Although pro-Southern at first, he came to believe it was paramount to preserve the Union and fought for the federal government. So we're going to talk about the next president. I'm sure you know who he is, Abraham Lincoln, next. And I appreciate you listening, and I hope that you'll dig into American history and come up with your own conclusions that you've gotten from studying primary sources, letters, with trusted historians, but their primary sources as well, letters, journals, newspaper accounts, legal speeches, things like that. So we'll go from there. We'll go on next time to Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, the American Civil War.